How do we hear the voice of God, and how do we respond? The dramatic story of conversion seems to set a standard that many are not able to meet. Yet we believe that the voice of God comes to each of us and all of us. Sometimes we hear that voice through the voices of others. The call can be communal at times. Attention during worship to listening for God's voice is helpful. Prayers focused on listening for God can direct our attention to that. Maybe even an appropriate time for silence would be helpful, but I'm guilty of this myself. We're not always comfortable with silence, and we want to fill it with something. Background music, movement. I always have music playing. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, there's always some background noise at my house. Perhaps this week it's time for us to be still and know that I am God. Let us focus our commitment on Christ again. Let's provide space to make and remake our commitment to be disciples, followers of Christ. Saul needed to be introduced to the one who was calling. We might need to be reintroduced to the one who calls us. What does it mean to say we are followers of Christ? Let's explore that together today. Our songs are songs of praise for Christ who calls us. Prayers are an invitation to Jesus to come and lead us, to walk with us, to guide our feet while we run this race called life. Christ is still calling. We aren't one and done on this journey. Let's renew our call, revive the passion we once had in Jesus' name. We might find our mission and ministry reinvigorated here in the church and ourselves by doing this. There are all sorts of ways to give witness to his name, to the name the Lord who calls us. The more we do and do it together, the further we travel on our discipleship path. During this week's sermon, Paul seems to root out the weed called the way and the followers of this upstart from Galilee named Jesus. Then he receives an invitation to join this movement that will change the world, even as it changes him. But wait, isn't Paul this Saul that changes his name? There are plenty of stories where the character receives a name change to signify a change in essence or something about his or her life. We think about Jacob, who was renamed Israel because he wrestled with God. We think about Abram and Sarai, who became Abraham and Sarah to signal their parenting of new people. We think of Simon, who was renamed Peter, the rock, so that Jesus could build a church on him. And we love the redemption story so much we talk about Saul, who became Paul because he gave up his former life in oppression in favor of a new walk with Jesus. But the name wasn't changed. Paul Saul lives in multiple worlds before he encountered Christ and continued to do so afterwards. The first time the new name is referenced is in Acts 13, verse 9, where it simply says, Saul, who was also called Paul. And he was both and he remained both. Some might say that Saul is the Hebrew context and Paul is the Gentile or Roman context, but he was both. That is not to say there wasn't a change or a redirection in his life. There certainly was. He refers to it many times in the letters he writes to the churches he helped. Here are the bare bones of the encounter without Paul's interpretation. It's a powerful story, and it's centered on identity. It starts in Acts. The full story is Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 20, but I'm only going to read the first 6 verses. Acts 9, verses 1 through 6. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from the heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. We see a dramatic conversion experience in this story. Saul was an extremely jealous Pharisee persecuting Christians who suddenly became a Christian himself. Saul was mean to the people who said that they loved Jesus. In fact, he was on his way to deliver a letter to the people who loved Jesus. Saul wanted them in jail. One day, Saul was on his way to Damascus, and while traveling to arrest people, a bright light flashed, and he fell to the ground. Saul, the voice he heard, asked why he was being mean. And Saul asked, "Who are you?" The voice said, "I'm Jesus. Now get up and go." When Saul got up, he couldn't see for 3 days. He also didn't eat or drink anything. And once he got to the city, God sent a man named Ananias to see Saul. When Ananias put his hands on Saul, something that looked like scabs fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. Saul completely changed from hating Jesus and wanting to hurt the people that followed him to loving him and wanting to tell others about him. And when you mentioned Gina's birthday, I thought about this. A letter is how we can deliver news to people. How can you tell people about Jesus? Most of us send emails now in this day and age, but you could use pen and paper, cards.